Welcome to the discussion. My guests today are Dave Frederick, the Deputy Director for Cybersecurity Directorate at the National Security Agency, Tim Coker, the Special Advisor for the Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response at the Department of Energy, Wally Coggins, the Director of the Intelligence Community Security Coordination Center in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, Matthew Eggers, the Vice President for Cybersecurity Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and Sanjay Gupta, the Chief Technology Officer at the Small Business Administration. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let me set some context for our discussion. Cybersecurity, it's like the classic 1980s horror film. Think Friday the 13th or Halloween. Every time you think you've gotten away from the killer, they just keep coming back. Every locked closet is busted open. Every time you think you've won, somehow the bad guy reemerges from the dead. But unlike the movies where the hero or heroine always wins, agency cybersecurity horror story feels like it never ends. Adversaries are ramping up their use of cyber attacks to steal intellectual property, manipulate and disrupt data, all in the name of creating a strategic and tactical advantage. The Defense Department, intelligence community, and civilian agencies must continue to defend systems and data today, as well as prepare for the constant evolution of cyber threats. The Internet Society says cybersecurity will be the most pressing challenge of the next decade. It says responses to date have been thoroughly insufficient, and the costs are escalating. Cyber attacks and cybercrime will shape the Internet and our relationship to it over the next decade. And the government will be caught in the middle. The Internet Society says citizens will expect agencies to respond to cyber threats. At the same time, agencies have to find the right balance of national security and online freedoms. So what steps can agencies take today to prepare for this scary future? What technologies and approaches will be critical and beneficial in protecting systems and data over the next decade? Well, that's where our panelists are going to come in and tell us all. Once again, my guests today are Dave Frederick, the Deputy Director of the Cybersecurity Directorate at the National Security Agency, Tim Coker, the Special Advisor for the Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response at the Energy Department, Wally Coggins, the Director of the Intelligence Community Security Coordination Center in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, Matthew Eggers, the Vice President of Cybersecurity Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and Sanjay Gupta, the Chief Technology Officer at the Small Business Administration. So I'm going to start with Dave from the NSA. I couldn't resist the horror story analogy. Maybe it's a little over the top. I was a big fan of Friday the 13th, but maybe it does feel that way. Like every time you think you get a step forward, the bad guy keeps coming back. Talk about the government's approach to cybersecurity, how it has evolved and where it's heading.
Well, defense is not a one and done, and so it's a constantly evolving threat. So a couple of areas in terms of the federal government's part I'd highlight. We've definitely improved in coordination. So I think the ability for multiple departments to get together, work on a cyber threat problem quickly, and then reach out and work with industries is definitely improving over the last few years. Other thing I'd highlight is our national cyber strategy. I think the strategic alignment between DHS, Department of Defense, other departments, the FBI, and the intelligence community has certainly improved in terms of where we were, say, 5, 6, 7 years ago.
You bring up an interesting point about the constantly evolving threat. At NSA, you guys get to see it maybe a little more black and white in details than the rest of us, and except for maybe Wally over there, but we'll get you in a sec. What about the threat's been evolving? Like, is it the nature of the threat? Is it the type of threat? We know ransomware, we can all talk about that, but what about the threat?
Well, the first thing to look at is think about how different your use of the internet and your use of IT is today than 10 years ago. So the attack surface, if you look at it from the hacker's point of view, the attack surface has expanded so much. In your home, you probably have Internet of Things devices. You certainly have multiple mobile devices. And so when you look at the challenge of trying to defend the nation's most sensitive networks, and you're dealing with that kind of an environment, there's just lots of options for the attacker. And so the defense side, we've really got to try to close all the doors. The attackers are just looking for one open door window. NSA has an advantage in terms of the problem and trying to understand creatively what we can do about the problem, because we do both an offensive mission, so we're doing an exploitation mission, trying to collect intelligence, support the nation, and we also have this important defensive mission to defend classified networks. And so that's an advantage for us. Our workforce gets to look at it from the scary side of the business and then flip over and really try to help protect.
I want to move over to Tim from the Energy Department. Attack surface. Your colleague Karen Evans, who is a former federal CIO, though she wouldn't like to be called that, so don't do it in front of her, tried to reduce the attack surface across government when she was over at OMB with something called Trusted Internet Connections. We won't go down that path because that gives a lot of people in the government kind of the shivers, like a bad horror story. But you have, as working with the energy sector, the attack surface is broader, bigger. You heard Dave mention Internet of Things. Talk about your approach to how you guys are helping the critical infrastructure sector understand where the threats are evolving today and where they're heading to tomorrow?
Yeah. First, Jason, thanks for having us on. I think that you've identified the problem correctly, which is that the world is rapidly changing much faster than most people are used to. I know Dave was talking about the threats 10 years ago or how you might have used technology 10 years ago. But today, I mean, I want to think back to just in 2015 in Ukraine, where just 4 years ago this month, we saw for the first time a cyber-enabled attack against an electric grid in another country. And that is really, I think, when people started focusing much more than they had in the past on what that threat could mean here in the United States. Now, for our part, I think that there's a lot of things that the Department of Energy, in collaboration with the energy sector broadly, as well as the electric subsector in particular, has been doing to address that problem. Secretary Perry, who recently departed, established our Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response just in the last 2 years, and said that it was one of his highest priorities to help protect the grid from these kind of cyber attacks. At the same time, we also now have a multi-year plan for energy sector cybersecurity, which is a separate and distinct plan from even the cybersecurity plan that we have for our own department or for our expanded DOE enterprise with all of our national laboratories, as well as other parts of the government. So we've really taken this approach very directly, and I think you can see over, like you were saying, that 3 to 7 year time frame, the development of the government's overall approach, whether it's PPD 21 looking at critical infrastructure cybersecurity, or how the government deals with a cyber incident, whether within itself or in industry more broadly with PPD 41. Those are all pieces that have slowly been coming together over time. And so we're really reaching a stage where it's not necessarily a new threat, but again, because the threat changes so quickly, the activities of 2015 in Ukraine are not necessarily the same attack vector that an actor would be looking to go after the American grid today, right? So it's a case of remaining vigilant, but it is something that that we at the Department of Energy have been looking at extensively in collaboration with the energy sector and our research and development teams at the national laboratories.
Do you get a sense, just from as you work with the energy sector, that Ukraine attack was that wake-up call that a lot of times we as a society seem to need to do something?
I certainly think it was with the American public. I think there were already conversations that were happening in the energy sector more broadly, whether it was IT teams that work on those kind of specialized IT systems, which we oftentimes refer to as operational technology or OT, that are similar but distinct in many ways from your typical IT that you might have at home or in your office. I think those conversations were already going on, but this was a first real example in the wild that everyone is tangibly aware of, where it actually had an impact, right? The power went off in Ukraine, I think, for something like 6 hours. So that was a tangible impact to that activity. And of course, it was only possible through a variety of means and how their particular systems were configured. But it showed that what was theoretical was now actually happening out in the real world.
And I know a lot of people would point to 2003 during the brownouts in the Northeast as, was that a cyber attack or not? Maybe Wally can tell us another time. But let's move on to Wally. When you guys at the IC Security Coordination Center look at the evolving threats, what are you seeing? Walk me through some of the challenges.
Sure. I totally agree with Dave's comment that the attack surface is rapidly increasing. The other big thing we're seeing is the real proliferation of weapons-grade tools and capabilities, whereas it used to take well-funded state actors to do some of the things that had been done historically. We're seeing those capabilities get out through the dark web to non-state actors, to everyday criminals and hackers, which is really increasing their capabilities and causing us to really need to up our game. I think one of the good things that's come out of that is like you said, the wake-up call. These groups are doing significant damage to government and private sector, and that's really helped us start to build the partnerships between the IC, where we have very good information, and we can help the private sector, we can help the other agencies in the U.S. government, whether it's state and local or federal, and we're getting a lot more support to overcome the barriers to sharing that information, some of the cultural things that have prevented us from doing that in the past and doing that in the future.
Without getting into too much sensitivities, if you're able to, when the proliferation of weapons-grade tools, did you guys start seeing that like just recently in the last couple years, or has that been building? Can you give me a little bit of perspective?
Yeah, it's certainly been building. I can't put a date on it, but it's been a trend that's certainly been increasing in the past year, 2, 3 years.
And it's a little scary because where you said, well, that's going to come from, pick your country, X, Y, or Z. Now it's, oh, that's coming from a organized crime, or that's coming from somebody who maybe you don't expect it, which that causes even more challenges, I would imagine.
Exactly. Attribution's always important, especially when we're setting national policy, how we're going to respond to these things. It's one way to respond to a nation state. It's another way to deal with a criminal group.
Yeah, absolutely. Matthew, I want to bring you into this. You're coming from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce with maybe a perspective that's a little different than the government folks, but you're still closely working together with the government side, public sector, private sector. You heard that a lot about collaboration. What are you seeing when you talk to your members, or even just broadly across the industry? Do they understand the cyber threats that they're facing?
Absolutely. I would say that at least on the threat front, I think the threats kind of remain the same, meaning plural threats, right? I think we're looking at nation states, their proxies or surrogates, criminal groups. I think those have remained constant over the last 3 to 5, 10 years plus. I think that dynamic won't go away, and I think just to kind of maybe put a picture in the ears of maybe your listeners or viewers is we're talking about threats that are happening below, let's say, the threshold of armed conflict. I think that's something that we're trying to get a better handle on, is how do we deal with those threats that needle away at our economic capabilities, our advantages, but our adversaries know that we can't bring everything to bear because they're operating below certain thresholds. We've got a broad swath of members. We've got companies that are very advanced, spending millions of dollars on their systems and so forth. We've also got companies out there, small, local, state chambers that are playing catch up. We're trying to help them think about how they manage risk day to day, how they do it from the top down, right? From the CEO or the president of a company down to the most recent hire. This challenge, I think, is going to be with us for a number of years. Maybe 3 things I would just quickly point that are signals, I think, that tell us that we're making some strides. The cybersecurity framework that industry and government put together in 2013-14, the information sharing bill in 2015, and then most recently, really good work around developing an IoT baseline for security. We can get into those, but I would say those are some high points.
I like the fact when you talk about the threats have remained the same. You said nation states, criminal groups. I was waiting for the third one, and for some reason I was waiting for the kid in the basement, the kitty hacker, what they call him. But you didn't mention it, and I think that's, to me, been the biggest change over the last decade is the one-off hacker who's just trying to get into systems. I think there's been this realization that, well, if I do that, Wally's going to come get me, or not you personally, Wally, we know, but the government will come get me. The FBI will show up at my door. I mean, is that something that industry is seeing as well, that there's less of that kind of individual person just trying to see if they could break into a company X's system? I don't know if that's something you guys are talking about.
I'm not sure that's gone away. My impression is when we talk to members, I think what they feel that is most impactful on a day-to-day basis, whether it's below that threshold or something that could go beyond, it's the nation-state actor, it's the surrogate, it's the criminal group, and that let's say the hacker in the basement. I think most entities will say we as a company or our service providers can mitigate that, generally speaking.
So, Sanjay, I want to bring you in because you bring the perspective of a smaller agency, but still you have big loans, you deal with lots of sensitive data. Talk about what you're seeing around cybersecurity.
Yeah, so certainly if you think about the small businesses, which is what the mission is for the Small Business Administration, they are in fact one of the most vulnerable entities. They don't necessarily realize the impact that they could have by a cyber threat to the business entity itself. So we are helping them from an education standpoint, from a training standpoint, from a counseling standpoint, to recognize the fact that cyber threat is real, and 2, it can be fairly serious from a business entity standpoint. The other angle I would probably talk about briefly is if you think about the policies, the federal policy standpoint, the way I'm seeing the change is the policies are becoming more nimble and agile, and it rightfully makes it important to become so, because the fact that we've just heard from our colleagues here that the threat landscape is very fast and dynamic and evolving. So our policies need to become more current. They need to be more, they're getting away from being a prescriptive model to a more adaptive model. They're becoming more outcomes driven as opposed to being mandates, if you will. And the case in point, I know you talked about the trusted internet connection, and I won't go into that, but that's a perfect example of where you're seeing a change in the federal policies where you're saying that the outcomes are more important than a prescriptive approach here. So I think that's important all around because it allows the agencies to become more nimble and be more outcome oriented.
Is there one area that SBA has seen an uptick in terms of the threats, or is there one type of threat that you're seeing more about? I mean, we heard, the different types throughout the panel. Is there anything from your, as an agency perspective?
I would say spear phishing tends to be one of the most common thing we are seeing. And we are, in fact, I'm proud to say that we are able to basically prevent those things from causing any serious damage. So that's one area we are seeing a continuing trend is in spear phishing.
It's interesting because it's moved from phishing attacks, right, where people are, hey, click on this link, to, hey, Sanjay, can you help me out? Here's my, click on this PDF.
Correct.
Or something. People are kind of, the attackers seem to be getting much more, I don't know, educated is the right word, but they're doing a better job of trying to fool us. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we can delve into this in much broader detail. You're listening to the discussion Cyber Futures 2020 and Beyond, sponsored by Raytheon on Federal News Network.